as people are getting in here, try and connect us over to play it in Facebook too. Sometimes it's a little hairy, so we'll see how it goes.
Oh, you already started the recording. I was going to do that.
Yeah, oh, it went automatic. You want to pause it, you can. Or
Yeah, that's all right. We can. So what happens when it reaches more than 100?
It just says it's full, but people just got an email just before saying that if that happens to them, then they can find us over on Facebook, on our Facebook page.
Go over to Facebook, correct? Isn't that what you mentioned before?
Right. Are you not hearing me as I'm saying this?
Yes, no. You should be.
We hear you.
Okay, good. Yes. Yeah, I said that. So I was like, oh. Yeah, I'm getting the Facebook starting. So as soon as that's done, then we can start. Up, maybe?
All right. Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome to the special Move to Men sponsored webinar on the immorality of the climate crisis and corporate rule. I'm Greg Coleridge, Move to Men Outreach Director and support staff for our Interfaith Caucus, which birthed the idea of this program. The Interfaith Caucus is where the nexus of climate change and corporate rule first germinated within Move to Amend. That is largely due to several individuals who've been faithful participants, some longer than others. Those include Michael Bleiweiss, Kathy Dodge, George Penn, Farrell Brody, and Mark Harding. But more than anyone else, it has been Michael Greenman, who kept raising the issue of climate change and making the connections to corporate rule. Thank you, Michael, who I know is on this call. There are three purposes of this program this evening. First is to explore the nexus or interconnections between morality, spirituality, and ethics to the climate crisis and to corporate rule in every direction, every which way, not linear in any stretch of the imagination. Second, to explore how to continue the conversation and translate the conversation into meaningful action. And third, to outreach to different organizations, both as we're doing tonight, but also ongoing, to forge ongoing relationships as we continue engaging with one another, supporting each other's actions, and exploring joint movement going forward. Before we start, a few logistics. Everyone is muted and can't see one another. If you want to ask a question or make a comment that you'd like one or more panelists to respond to, please share them in the chat. That's that little bubble icon at the bottom of your screen, which should be, and that's as opposed to the pandemic bubble. So we won't go there. I'll share whatever comments or questions arise depending on time constraints during that segment of the program. That will be at the end. There will be means of communicating this evening in the interest of time, and that is sort of the main way. We can't sort of access you to go live because, well, we're trying to get as many comments and questions as possible. So again, comments, questions, please insert them into the chat. The agenda for this 90-minute program is listed in the chat. It's 10 minutes for each presenter, and I will alert people at the 8-minute mark. 20-minute then questions, conversations between panelists, which should be pretty interesting, following all of their respective remarks. And then the rest of the time, response to questions or comments in the chat. Well, we're very excited to have 4 very insightful panelists this evening to share their reflections, engage with each other, and take your questions and comments. Bios of speakers were linked to the event notice on our website, so just go back and find those. I won't take the time to share their very impressive backgrounds because that would take up chew up half of the time this evening. Panelists are, in order of their presentation, listed on the agenda with one exception, and that is Casey Camp. Horinek will sort of jump over Kaitlin because, hey, Move to Amend, we believe in guests should go first. So the order will be Shannon, Colin, Casey, and then Kaitlin. So welcome one and all. So let's begin with you, Shannon. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. It's an honor to be part of a Move to Amend webinar. I'm been working with Kaitlin in one degree or another for many, many years around related issues. I'm the co-founder of Movement Rights, and we work on the idea of shifting law and culture, human law and culture, to align with the laws of the natural world, which is one way to talk about rights of nature. And the work that we do really does intersect with system change in terms of corporate rule in particular, and community rights, and all of the issues surrounding the flaws of our Constitution, which are really put there to push forward the idea of property and wealth in the hands of a few, and decision making in the hands of a few. And I don't think that anybody on this call is probably new to those ideas. The rights of nature piece that we've been asked to bring today to this conversation really strikes at this corporate rule piece, because on the one hand, we say corporations are persons in law, which of course they're not. They're actual property. However, Mother Earth, nature, the source of life, is actually seen in law as property. And in the sense that corporations are the largest property owners on the planet, and that corporations dominate our political system, our legal system, and everything in between, our social norms. All of these things are impacted in terms of how we understand our relationship with the rest of the earth. So if we say humans have rights, and they come by virtue of being born, then we have to recognize that the earth itself is a giver of life. The cosmos itself is a giver of life, and that our human rights are dependent on this idea that the natural world has rights, and that we have to shift law that says nature is property if we are ever to shift the idea also of what is our human relationship to the rest of life. We have been told this story of separation, that humans are above nature, that we can use nature, that nature is a natural resource. Those are all ideas that coincide with this idea that corporations are persons, and using those privileges, I would say, because I don't believe that corporations have rights. They're not living entities. They are not. It's a legal fiction on paper, and yet corporations have more say over what life looks like for us, in terms of the power they have within the body politic, within our laws. So around the world, what we've seen, and in particular with indigenous communities around the world, is this growth of the idea that that we can't protect nature, we can't stop climate change until we reconcile our human relationship with the earth and with each other. And rights of nature is a really big piece of that has been growing all around the world. We see, from countries in Ecuador and Bolivia and New Zealand and Colombia and Costa Rica, and India, and in communities in the United States, and most recently, indigenous communities in the United States, or Turtle Island. And Casey Camp Horinek will talk a little bit to that. So our work at Movement Rights is to really connect the dots between the kind of work Move to Amend does. I mean, we all, all of our work really intersects around this, this idea that corporations are just a way to, what they really should be is, more than just a way to make a widget or make a profit. But they are not persons. They do not deserve a role, a decision-making role in how we treat the earth, whether you want to call it Mother Earth, whether you want to call it nature. There are a million words. And Rights of Nature has been part of this really growing movement that isn't just about, it's about saying, it's about as revolutionary as saying slaves are no longer property. It is really about shifting culture, to shift laws, to recognize that we are not owners of nature. We can't continue to destroy the earth for profit. And how do we then begin to rebuild the world that we need, based not on destroying nature, but on understanding how do we fit into the circle and the web of life, and starting from that point to make laws and to make decisions, starting with what does the river need? Or as a speaker on one of our recent webinars put it, asking who is the river? So I think I'll stop there.
Wonderful comments, and even under time. Terrific.
So
Next, Colin Bossen, Senior Minister, First UU Church of Houston. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Greg, and to Move to Amend for the invitation to be part of tonight's panel. It's really good to be with all of you. The subject we're grappling with is huge and hugely important. And so I'm going to focus rather than what should we do as an ethic from the perspective of religious ethics. And so we here, I mean, members of what I would call self-governing religious communities, primarily those of the liberal or humanistic varieties in the United States. I apologize for the limited appeal, but one of the functions of speech convince people to engage in conscious action. And as a minister and theologian, I suspect that my remarks will be most effective if I direct them towards those of you who might be inspired by my words to integrate a challenge to corporate rule into your religious lives. By their very nature, I propose, it should be among the purposes of such self-governing communions to oppose corporate rule. In my time with you, I want to think about corporate rule, the origins of congregational self-governance, and the opportunities that congregational self-governance offer us to oppose corporate rule. Corporate rule. The anthropologist David Graeber made a compelling argument that our society is transitioning to a new kind of feudalism. In his study of how corporate culture, bullshit jobs, a theory. Sorry, my cat just jumped up and jumped down on the desk. In his study of how corporate culture functions, a highly entertaining book titled Bullshit Jobs, a Theory, are less and less about making things and more about political processes for appropriating, distributing, and allocating money and resources. Pointing to the rise of finance corporations and financialization, he observes that the international economic system has become one of rent extraction, where companies primarily make money by charging interest on debt. A lot of companies you might think are in the business of creating goods derive their profits from financing. The interest it sells on car loans than from selling cars. This dynamic has led to a situation similar to medieval feudalism, a hierarchical system where those at the top built their wealth upon and power upon grabbing a pot of loot from either one's enemies or extracting it from In the old feudal order, people of the pinnacle maintained loyalty by redistributing a portion of their gains to underlings who worked to ensure stability by justifying and protecting the arrangement. These underlings included clergy, who owed their positions to whichever lord controlled the congregations they served. There was no separation of church and state. The monarch and the nobles effectively controlled both. This is a vastly oversimplified picture. A lot of stupid European religious wars in the Middle Ages were about whether the Pope or the princes were in charge. But the general point, during this period, it was in the interest of the clergy to develop theological doctrines that encouraged the peasants to go along with the whole thing. This is where we get such nonsense as the divine right of kings and Martin Luther proclaiming anyone who rebelled merited death in body and soul. Self-governing religious community. Some, like the Quakers, rejected the idea that clergy were necessary and dispensed with them. Others, such as the congregations that eventually became Unitarian Universalist, appointed their own clergy. The belief that ordinary people could and should take responsibility for their own religious lives. Rather than belonging to a religious community because they were told they had to be by some noble, they voluntarily joined one. Within each person lay the spark of the divine. The communal task was to nurture the and the congregations aligned with the feudal order, a relationship with God flowed from top to bottom. The priest was needed to mediate it, or the state-sanctioned minister was the only one who properly understood it. And what became known as the left wing of the Reformation with God was more horizontal. Each individual had the inborn ability to cultivate it. The theologian James Luther Adams named this belief the dignity of responsibility and had profound congregations into schools and laboratories for democratic practice. To take an active role in a communion was to learn to read, to interpret a text, to make an argument, to manage the collective resources, and to cast a vote or come to consensus on what was to be done. This stood in direct conflict with the reigning practices of feudalism, and it's why eventually seedbeds for revolution against the old feudal order. Once people learned how to exercise democracy in one area of their lives, they wanted to extend it to others. Before considering how contemporary self-governing congregations might provide us resources, this is an entirely Eurocentric account. Such, it's problematic on at least two levels. First, it elides the relationship between self-governing congregations and the United States' origins in and ongoing practices of settler colonialism. As Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz has noted, the myth that this country originated in a group of faithful citizens, the king, and pledged to each other and to God to form and support a goodly society, has its very roots in the religious practices I've been uplifting. There is a clear line from such foundational myths and the ongoing practices of genocide directed by the federal government and corporations. Second, it neglects the history of self-governing African-American congregations. They arose in opposition to a different kind of feudalism, the brutal regime of chattel slavery. Outside of direct control by white supremacists, they became spaces to develop, in the words of Albert Raboteau, an agency of self-control, a source for political activity, a sponsor for education, and a refuge in a hostile white world. Put differently, there's a reason why members and clergy of these congregations have provided so much of the support in opposition to white supremacy and the leadership for grassroots labor unions and other organizations devoted to social and therefore must be adjusted to recognize that the greatest sources of opposition to corporate feudalism have come from the communities from which it extracts the most. White wealth has been principally off the unpaid or underpaid labor of people of color and the expropriation of indigenous lands. Within my tradition, we claim that revelation is not sealed. Our theology challenges us to wrestle with what we might even name the ongoing structures of evil so that we can have a different future. One of our tasks then becomes to reinvigorate European traditions of self-governance while recognizing the ways we have become complicit with and benefited from the system of corporate rule. Dismantling white supremacy both inside of and outside of our own institutions, the power of corporations. Otherwise, we will simply perpetuate the very power structures we hope to disrupt. Religious communities like mine continue to have significant resources we can use if we decide that we want to oppose the contemporary iteration of feudalism. And we should be opposed to it if we or the inner light within. Corporate rule leads many people to toil in what are essentially meaningless jobs and struggle with despair. In surveys, as many as 40% of workers self-report that their jobs have no good reason to exist. Meanwhile, 1 out of 10 people in the richest country in human history have grown unimaginably wealthy. The resources we have are not necessarily material. They exist in the form of practices of self-governance, which must be constantly re-examined with the lens of anti-racism. Like earlier generations of religious liberals and religious humanists, members of my congregation and might reimagine the way we organize ourselves as part of our religious practice. Rather than thinking of meetings as a means to an end, we could reconceive them as a kind of ritual. In a ritual, we often attempt to transform one state of our being to another. The ritual of marriage marks the passage by which two people become united into. Think of our meetings as rituals where we learn to live democratically, and in doing so, stir the divine within. Thus stirred, we could take that divinity outside of our communities and bring more democratic practice into the wider world. Imagine what a threat to corporate rule that would be. Here, a closing coda. You might observe that I've come all this way without mentioning corporate personhood. As theologians, we call attorneys and judges. I'm not equipped to contest with them on their own ground, but I can remember the words of Audre Lorde: the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. And I can choose different tools and deconstruct the house that way.
Great, thank you, Colin. It was a little choppy in sections. I mentioned in the chat that you might be so kind as to share your written remarks that we then can share
Absolutely.
with everyone. And for whatever reason couldn't participate, and we can do that along with the link to this program, which we will do anyway. So if you're able to send that my way in the next day or two, that'd be terrific. Great. Well, next is Casey Camp Horinek, Environmental Ambassador to the Ponca Nation of Oklahoma. Welcome, Casey.
Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me. Thank you for inviting me. My girl Shannon asked me to be part of this, and for her, I'll do this. I feel very attached to the message that she brings, and we work well together. I'm listening as much as I can, and I just ask for help from Wakanda, from Majahube, and for all of my relations. Wakanda is the word that we use for the Great Spirit. Majahube is the sacred earth. And when I ask for help from all that is, all my relations, we're talking about those relatives that are often seen as that property that was spoken of earlier. What people call resources, we take the re off, and those are sources of life. And I was reminded when I was listening to Shannon about all of the value system that our ancestors have left us with that is not called religion. It is a direct link to the Great Spirit, to the great mystery that was attempted to be severed when the papal bull edict came out that called for the doctrine of discovery to say that our way of talking to Wakanda was less than the organized religion of Catholicism and so many of the others. And that Christianity came onto the shores of where we live and voiced a way of superiority that doesn't sit well. Video here. Can you see me now? There's a video on.
No. We can hear you fine.
Well, on mine it is. I'm not sure why the video quit working, but maybe there's a reason for that as well. And I'm comfortable with that. Let me see if we add some light and see if that works a bit. Is there a person here?
I don't think it's about light. It's like a totally black screen. Like the video is just disconnected. So
It's interesting. Let me see how that works now. Cannot start your, it says I can't start my video because the host has stopped it. So whoever the host is. Am I on?
Sounds like something funky is happening, Casey, because I don't think we did stop it. So everyone can hear you really well.
Yeah, but we did not take any action of any
All
kind.
right.
Sorry about that.
Well, maybe they're talking about a larger host than any of you might be, huh?
That may be.
Maybe the host is that great mystery we're talking about. So we'll look at that one. I'm going to back up again and talk about the doctrine of discovery and the impact that it has had. It's very good for me to be a part of you and to listen to your viewpoints around organized religion, because the religion portion of it for me is a separate entity from spirituality. And spirituality for me, and coming from the Ponca perspective, is to recognize that all things are connected to all things. And by things, I'm saying the deer, the fish, the water itself, the sacred air that we breathe, the fire that lives within the human as well, volcano from the Father, Son, the Moon Mother, and the rhythms that she contains and is part of. And when folks came onto the shores of what we call Turtle Island or North America with a different form of understanding, they came with a sense of entitlement that was given to them through the doctrine of discovery, saying that if we were not Christian, therefore they could claim what the great mystery put us in caretaking of. And for us, that's where this idea of corporate ownership started, was with that very edict itself and how it enabled those who wanted to claim property as their own, including women. Because we came from a balanced society where men and women had the same understanding of and same concept of how to be balanced within a society itself, how feminine and masculine energy were part of everything, and one was not superior to another, where ageism didn't exist because children were every bit as valued in their opinions and their ways of connecting with spirituality as the adults around them, where there were no old folks' homes because we took care of our elders, where there was no jails, because if you violated the natural laws, which are taking care of one another, loving one another, and being part of all that is, then you were banished. You simply were not part of the people as they existed at that time. So the connections and the interconnections that we valued at that time have carried to the time of being kidnapped, as my mother was at the age of 6, into boarding school and told that she must learn the Bible, she must have her hair cut off, she must speak English as we are now, she must wear a uniform, or she would be beaten. And she was violated, as were all the other children, by being removed from their homes for at least 9 months a year, up until she was 15, and she ran away for about the 10th or 20th time and made it back to this place called a reservation, which was in actuality a POW camp where we were imprisoned. We still found our way back to the original instructions of our people through all of that, through the ancestral knowledge, past the doctrine experiment of discovery into being able to work hard to exert sovereignty once again, because within that sovereignty was the understanding of the so-called immutable Ponca rights of nature. We didn't proselytize. We didn't try to pull people into our spirituality because it exists for all in every form of talking to Wakanda, the great spirit, the great mystery. And our communication was directly with that being, that our understanding of what the great mystery is, what the great spirit is the combination, the culmination of all living things are the great spirit. And within that, we're all connected. And that's who we speak to. There's no intermediaries. We go directly. We have many medicine men, they call them, but they're in our language called interpreters. And they're the ones who interpret what the natural world is saying to us. And when Movement Rights and I work on rights of nature, we try to help people understand that we're not here as humans to protect nature. We are nature, protecting itself. And when one comes from that perspective and one understands that as a human, if you eat, if you drink, and if you breathe, you are recognizing your oneness with all of those things that you ingest, that builds the cells that you are, that become part of your blood memories, that sustain this thing we call a robe, that in English language it's called the body, that is worn over your spirit, because each one of us has an individual spirit that is connected intricately with Wakanda, with the Great Spirit. And through those ways that we put this robe over that spirit, we're connected intricately with our mother, the earth, who has no favorites among us. She sustains us all in the manner in which was intended until these things called corporations began to make claims on property. Whether that claim was on the property of the waters, on the air itself through carbon trading and polluting, on manufacturing what genetics should go into the seeds, on doing the farming on the mega farms and claiming land, through the every way that corporations look at claiming and sucking from the earth, the oil, the gas, whatever it might be, and saying that it belongs to them and that it has a monetary value. In our original societies, we didn't have money in the same way. We didn't manufacture a false sense of one having more than the other. Those that were elevated into our society as chiefs or matriarchs were there because they gave more than anybody else, not took more, not accumulated more. So we have arrived in a very sense of urgency that all human beings have to face and understand that as takers, as the ones who have mismanaged and unbalanced the natural laws, that we have to be able to understand that as quickly as COVID shut us down for a couple of weeks to begin with, the earth began to regenerate. She began to heal. The air became healthier. The waters became clearer. The animals began to come back into the villages. The fish began to multiply. The plants began to grow. And humans, in turn, were able to eat, drink, and breathe better. We have to return away from those corporations into our little family gardens, whether it's a tomato plant. Teach our children What is the value system that is going to sustain you? And that
1 minute.
value system can be echoed. That value system can be echoed in the indigenous understanding of how we are all related. And it's a very scientific method as well. And it's not something you're going to find in a book. It's something you're going to find in your spirit. When you hear the truth, it has a power of its own. We are not here as humans protecting nature. We are nature protecting itself. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Casey.
Thanks, Casey. So I'm glad
Okay,
that
Kaitlin, Director, National Director, Move to Men.
Hey everybody, I'm really sorry that my internet is not ideal. So Greg, like wave your arms at me if I break up and I'll back up. Just got to this new location and not quite got it all figured out yet. Thank you so much, Colin and Casey and Shannon, for being here with us, and to the Interfaith Caucus for putting this together and pushing us to have this conversation. I'm really excited about a number of the things that the other speakers have brought up, because I feel like from Move to Amend's perspective, these are things that many of us have wanted to talk about for quite some time, but the mainstream dominant culture in the United States wasn't ready to have these conversations. So I'm really glad that Casey talks so much about the doctrine of discovery, because I think that's a really important component that we need to understand, that is a piece of what the legal foundation of this country is all about. And one thing that I know that those of you who have been with Move to Amend for a while have heard me say many times is that it's not an accident that we're in the situation that we're in now, where we are on literally the brink of survival as not just our species, but many other species as well that we could take out with us. And so much of that is centered in the culture that the United States has spread to the world of corporate capitalism. And it's not an accident that we're here from a country that was founded on stealing the property, the land of people who were here when Europeans arrived, and then also stealing human beings from Africa and bringing them here and turning them legally and, in terms of what their lives were, into property. And now we're in a situation where property, which is what corporations are, and others have said this, has more rights, more ability, more sovereignty than human beings, and obviously certainly more than nature and the rest of the beings that live here. And so it's really important for us. It's not that the United States is the only place that is carrying this out, but we're like the belly of the beast. We're the epicenter. And it's so important that we recognize that this story, this creation story of what the United States supposedly is built on lies. And so, it's built on lies that justifies corporate personhood. It's built on lies that justifies the theft of human beings and making them work as property. It's built on lies that the doctrine of discovery, for folks who maybe are not familiar with it, Casey described in better than I could, what the implications are. But just so people understand what it meant, what it was, is that, and still is used in law today, the idea that if Christians were not occupying land, then it was just available to be taken and privatized oftentimes for corporations literally, or for Christians. And so colonists used that, European colonists used that framework, and then it was built into the United States law. And a lot of that was, the foundation of it was a case where the lead justice of the Supreme Court who wrote it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who I know, you know, we have been celebrating recently in terms of all that she did for white women, but it's important to look at every single one of these people that we hold up as our heroes in terms of mainstream America. There's this backstory of like what is being propped up and at whose expense is potentially other people, you know, whether in this case when we're talking about RGB, you know, white women, but on whose backs were those rights moved forward. So I think that it's just, you know, part of what Move to Amend has been about all along is telling the truth, uncovering this truth. Who started Move to Amend, about uncovering, trying to understand what is going on here. Why is it when we try to battle corporations, oftentimes in the interest of protecting the planet, which is where a lot of the founders of kind of Move to Amend come from, is doing environmental work and recognizing that not only are we not making gains, but we're moving backwards. If you look at the last, you know, 50 years of environmental activism in this country, you know, so many people, more people than when I was younger, sort of recognize this idea of like, we have to protect the environment, and yet it's in worse shape than ever. So like, why is that? And you know, what, the folks at the Program on Corporations, Law and Democracy Unlimited and the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, who Shannon was working with when she was at the founding meeting of Move to Amend, you know, we're coming together because we realized that even with all this activity and this cultural maybe understanding that we do have a responsibility and a role to play in protecting the planet, as Casey has said, because we're part of it. Yet, you know, we're losing ground, and it's because corporations have more rights and more ability and more power. It's not just about their money. It's about that they have a trump card that they can use, which is our Constitution, against us. And why? I would say because our Constitution, it's a myth that is our Constitution. We didn't write that Constitution. People who look like us on this call or who come from the class backgrounds of us on this call didn't write the Constitution. Yes, we drove, you know, we have foremothers and forefathers who wrestled with it and were able to insert some language that we could sometimes like pin something on for some of our rights and abilities to protect ourselves. But the reality is it doesn't come from principles of democracy for everyone and protecting the planet and caring about not just our rights, but our responsibilities collectively to each other. None of that is really in the framework of what our Constitution is about. And so one of the things that I wanted to say, and I forgot to press the timer, so Greg, you know, cut me off if I go over the 10, is that I wanted to invite everybody to another event later on this month, People's Movement Assembly on Imagining a New Constitution, on October 24th and 25th. And we really want to take the conversation there. We're going to continue to work against corporate constitutional rights because that trump card is so powerful and so effective at squashing our people's movements. And so often, as we all know, those movements don't necessarily even know that it isn't about, you know, this particular situation here. It's about, you know, what's going on underneath and a whole system that is prioritizes, you know, corporate private property rights over the rights of the collective need, whether that's, you know, people or the planet. And so, you know, that's important work that Move to Amend is absolutely going to continue to do. But we want to, thank you, but we want to take it deeper than that, because we think that this is the time. You know, this is the time, because we are in this existential crisis moment that has already begun. I hate that clock that tells us, you know, how much time we have till climate change is irreversible. We're already there. We're already there. We're already past it. It's too late. It's a nice try that we can imagine that we have 7 years, but we don't. It's already too late. There are already species that are going to be you know, destroyed, ruined, extinct from this planet because of us. And there are also, you know, millions of people whose lives will be affected no matter what we do, you know, even if we start tomorrow. And so this is the time. And I guess I'll just end with reminding us, I just have been trying to take inspiration from Arundhati Roy's looking at the pandemic as a portal that we need to pass through, not, you know, certainly as a country, but I also think as a species, and it potentially, you know, it's an opportunity that nature has given us to reassess what the hell we've been doing. And it obviously is, you know, really hard to talk about it and think about it that way, as I have a mom with, you know, incredibly weak lungs. We're here in Phoenix now because she's due to hopefully get a lung transplant. And so coronavirus is incredibly dangerous, like, to my family. And I know that many of you have been affected by it. And so looking at it as an opportunity is like a little bit of a weird twist. But from my perspective, I think that, you know, we might as well look at it that way. We might as well look at it as that we're on the brink and that we can make a shift and then act and figure out how to act. If that were true, if the moment is aligning right, then how would we act if that were true? And if it proves that it isn't true, well, you know, at least we'll have been in the right headspace and moving in the right direction, and then we'll see. But I do like to think of the idea that that nature is sending us a message and trying to tell us that we need to pay attention to things in a different way than we have. And obviously there are people who have been paying the right attention all this time, but collectively, you know, in terms of mainstream. So I'll leave it there and look forward to, you know, the questions and discussion that we're going to have for the rest of this time too.
Well, thank you, Kaitlin. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Colin. Very powerful collective reflections. All right, we have dedicated now the next few minutes for those of you to kind of go at it between yourselves. What questions, comments, inspirations, concerns were raised by what each of you said that others want to amplify, get more information about, critique, whatever the case may be. Go ahead, Kaitlin.
I have a question that is for Shannon and Casey as well, and you guys can kind of, I know that we could do a whole webinar on this, but probably the idea of like rights of nature is, you know, really new to some of the people who are here possibly. And there are a number of countries that have, you know, framework and law similar to ours, and then tried to kind of bring in this traditional framework at the same time. So I'm wondering if you could just share with us some examples of, you know, like Ecuador, New Zealand, some of the examples, so that people understand that this isn't something that like is that we have to start from scratch on.
Right. Casey, if you don't mind, I'll start off, or do you want to start? Casey's giving me the nod. Okay. So I think one of the things when we talk about rights of nature, what are we talking about? We're talking about, do we believe that nature has the right to exist? Do we believe that nature has the right to evolve its vital cycles? Do we believe that water has the right to flow? And do we believe that our lives are interconnected with all of the rest of the species on, you know, on Earth? Do we need to? I think of rights of nature on the one hand as from a legal perspective, it's about shifting to a model that says nature is no longer property and we do not get to destroy it at will. So from from a legal standpoint, that's the framework. We're saying, yes, it is it has rights, and not human right to water, but on its own. And the other parts to rights of nature, I think, are the indigenous underpinning that is so critical to rights of nature that Casey's been talking about, which is really recognizing that, you know, and part of the story of Christianity and the doctrine of discovery is this idea that we are separate, that we could draw a line on a map and say, this belongs to you and this belongs to you, and you can do with whatever you Christians want to do with this, and whatever you find there, whatever people you find there, whatever animals you find there are your property, and you can do with it as you will. And all of that is out of bounds with indigenous cosmology that recognizes that we are part of the system of life, just one part. We're not special, any more special than any other thing, from a microbe to a deer, to a cloud, and that we are all part of this system and this cycle. We have to, so that's part of the cultural shift, and part of also understanding that, you know, indigenous people, especially those that remain intact, and why rights of nature and similar, sometimes they use different words, legal personality, or and other things, why rights of nature has been evolving really from indigenous cosmology around the world. In New Zealand, it was the Maori that put this forward, because for them, recognizing that the Wanganui River was not property was also because that river is their ancestor. They are the river people. They have a saying, from the mountain to the sea, I am the river, and the river is me. And for them, as long as that river is bound in the chains of property, they too were also bound, as property. And for them, they told us when we were there on a delegation, and they said, putting this in law isn't really just for us. It's for everyone else. It's for the Pakeha, which are the white settler populations of New Zealand, or Aotearoa as they call it, to understand our worldview. And in Ecuador, passing this at the Constitution was possible in part because 52% of the population of Ecuador is indigenous. And a lot of places around the world where this work has emerged, the underpinnings of this is a reconnection between humans and the rest of the natural world. And if we are, whoever is, whatever portion of the humanity is to remain, the clock countdown that Kaitlin talked about is so true. I mean, we're here, we're in the mass extinction. All of this is happening. It doesn't mean that it's time to give up or to stop fighting, but it's time to recognize what is our role. So this rights of nature movement, on the one hand, is a legal change. On the other hand, it's recognizing indigenous traditional ecological knowledge of how to live in balance with the earth. Over 80% of the world's intact forests are protected because of indigenous wisdom, the indigenous people, forest dwelling people living there. We have a lot to learn from this wisdom of living in a different way. And it doesn't mean, giving up your iPhone or any of those things. This is about moving forward in a way that is in balance with the earth based on where we are now. And the third thing that rights of nature is, that is absolutely in line with Move to Amend and all the work that they've been doing, is this is fundamentally about system change. This is radical work. This is confronts the Constitution. This confronts corporate personhood. This confronts corporate power, and says that no, Mother Earth is not property for corporations to use and control, and to determine the quality of our life. Do I care if a corporation, I'm happy for a corporation to make my toothpaste or make my bicycle, that's fine, but but when it comes to determining the quality of life, right now, where Casey lives, she is in the middle of fracking country, and her people are dying every single day because of decisions that are based on this idea of corporate personhood, and this idea of corporations and a wealthy elite making decisions that Mother Earth is property for exploitation.
Great. All right, other questions for others? Or comments? Queries? If not, we could move to the attendees and some of the comments they had. Sort of a raging conversation going on. Several themes or tracks, one of which has to do with property and how sacred is it? Is there a distinction? I'm kind of adding this in because there seems to be some question. Is there a distinction between sort of maybe earned property, that which comes from one's own efforts, versus privileged property, or something of which one unfairly acquires? Any legitimate distinction to be made there? What's people's belief around just property in general?
Well, I would say one real quick, and others might want to add in. I mean, I just have a lot of trouble figuring out how you answer that question in a country that was stolen from people who originally inhabited it and still do. And then also people who, I mean, the point that I made before, it's like earned. How is anything here earned? I think we need to reconcile that and then figure out. And then also the points that's being raised of like, and what about the land itself? Anybody else want to add in?
I mean, it's a huge question. I don't feel like I have much to add that Kaitlin didn't just say. I think that the idea of like ownership of the land is, and that we are somehow separate from things and can own them is, I mean, clearly at the heart of like what we're struggling with, especially this upside own people essentially, or have gotten to a point where they can own, other things. So yeah. I think that, well, yeah, I guess that's what I'm just saying.
Okay. Question, how best can we begin amplifying the message that the military industry, in symbiosis with the oil and gas industry, is responsible as the world's major polluter, influencing our elected officials while also illustrating how patriotic it is to fight for action on reining in these polluters' control of our government? Also a big topic. Anyone want to take that?
Want to let everybody else go.
How do we amplify this message about the role of the military-industrial complex and its nexus with the oil and gas industry?
I mean, I guess I'll say, I think some of it is a matter of saying it, and you know, as Shannon pointed out, like people who are living in the places where those two things are coming together, it's like it is a war on them. So that's one piece. The other thing too is that I think that, I mean, I don't know exactly about how to amplify it more, but I will say that I do take hope in the fact that if you look at, I mean, just one small thing is if you look at the message of like Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016 versus 2020, I think that around foreign policy and talking about that is there was more willingness to talk about it and more I think interest on the part of the base of people to understand those connections and to name them and talk about them. So I think that there is movement moving forward. Not that Bernie Sanders is the be all end all of anything. I'm just using that as like a marker in terms of, you know, what the dominant conversation on the part of sort of the progressives or the left or whatever was willing to say about that, and that, you know, there was a lot more progress in that. I don't know if anybody else has anything that you want to
add. I would just say that, you know, a lot of the work that we do at Movement Rights is also about elevating the voices of Black, Indigenous, people of color, the communities that are most impacted by climate change, most impacted by the fossil fuel industry, and also that it has been Black and brown bodies that have put themselves on the line. I know that, you know, that physical line has definitely been challenging under COVID, but I think that there has been a huge shift in, you know, putting all of these things together, putting police brutality and systemic racism, you know, and, you know, Mother Earth and corporate power, you know, all of these things are connected, you know, that Move to Amend and Movement Rights and UU Church and a lot of other organizations are working on this mosaic of change. But we really do, it's, as we all know, voting is, you know, the beginning. It's certainly not the end of what we need to do. But we also need to be really listening to the leadership of Black, Indigenous people of color.
May I speak to that a bit?
Please.
I'm listening and I'm also reading the chat, and it feels as if everyone is already very boxed in with their thoughts from what I'm seeing. It feels as if people are looking for a book to maybe enlighten each other with and say, you should read this, or Thomas Berry said that. And all of those things are already passé. They've already been said. They're not being today, which is the difference. Again, I'm going to go through this, the difference between a religious viewpoint and spirituality. Because spirituality means that you're in the spirit of the moment, the instant that you're existing in. And we're existing in a place of change. The earth is changing. She's in the process, and our way of understanding, and I'm talking very personally here, not all Indigenous people, but the way that I was taught is that there was a purification going to happen. And that purification was because the earth herself was being so despoiled, as women were at the same time, and being looked at as something that could be used and discarded. It's being looked at that way at the water and the air, the seeds, the soil, the oil, the gas and every finite thing that exists is being looked at as a way that war should maybe we militarize the police whenever we're called to Standing Rock so they can contain the human beings who are trying to protect the water. That's an example I can give you, where they numbered our arms and put us into cages as protectors and defenders of the sacred. But we're at a position right now where there no longer needs to be discussion. There has to be action. And if that action is creating a rights of nature statute that have been discussed, take that action. If the action is that you go outside and you plant something and you teach a child how to grow something, that's an action. If the action is that you recognize the rights of the river that is in your community to exist so that your future generations can exist, that's an action. If the action is to vote, vote. But the time for talk, the time for reading, and almost the time for discussion is today. Should our species want to continue to exist and to have these natural laws be in place for the generations to come? As it is, we can't take the time to continue to discuss everything. There has to be action that goes with it. My understanding is that energy follows intent. And if it is our intention to realign the natural laws with the laws that human beings are foolish enough to try to create to make themselves more comfortable, then we have to do that. Not tomorrow, starting tonight, starting yesterday. But in your heart right now, you form the intention to make a difference, and then you begin to do it. That's what a warrior is. A warrior is not a person that creates strife and bad feelings and pain for someone else. A warrior is someone who protects, defends, loves, and makes a way for the next person who can't do it to go forward. So warrior up, warrior up.
Beautiful and inspiring comment. So what is the action? I see a number of comments, certainly affirming Casey's call to action. Sort of in that spirit, what, sort of reflecting some of these last comments, what is the call to action that potentially can connect these three differing strands of this webinar? That of spirituality, ethics, climate change, and corporate rule.
Well, I'll just say, and then would love to hear others, to reiterate that it's not an action in the sense that I think maybe people are thinking, but it's a place to plan action, which is the People's Movement Assembly that we're holding on imagining a new constitution later this month. And I think that, as an organization, speaking as Move to Amend, we are wanting to figure out how to take action in a way that is more than the piece that we have been addressing, or the action that we have been calling for, which is amend the Constitution, which is a huge thing, right? And then we also want to name that it's not big enough. And so what does that mean? What do we do as an organization? What's our responsibility there? How can we broaden? How can we connect with others? And so the People's Movement Assembly is a place to do that in a participatory way, to start to answer those questions. Like, we as Move to Amend, what will we be doing? And we're still in our framework of, looking at the foundational law of this country and the fact that it isn't serving us, and understanding the reasons why that would be true. And understanding that that's not about recent corruption, that's about foundational corruption. And so therefore, what does that leave us to do? Which, there's no one action that's gonna like flip it all. And I think Americans love to imagine that that's possible, and that's a fallacy that's problematic. So we shouldn't do that, but we also do need to act as powerfully as possible, and be strategic and effective and not think small. So that's kind of what we're inviting everybody to do with us. And I would love to hear where Shannon and Casey and then Colin are in terms of ways that folks can take action with the work that you're doing.
I mean, I can speak, I guess. Arrived at this point after many generations of, I'm just going to say, stupidity, and we are now at a moment of crisis, and the things that seem as possibilities of ways for suggest that they take far more time than I'm going to stop my video. Let's see.
Yeah, you're kind of breaking up.
Does that improve? Does that improve things, hopefully?
So far.
Okay. So, I mean, I think that the real challenge is exactly that we are in a situation where seem to be possibilities for moving forward or to address the situation probably takes significantly more time than the amount of time it feels that we really have. And so the question, how to act in that situation. And I wish I actually had like concrete answers, like as to like, this is the thing we should be doing to get our way out of it. I mean, the things that I can suggest are to look at the local ways that you can get involved in communities and think about locally within the context of like a local congregation or within the context of a local environmental movement, none of which are necessarily going to turn the ship, so to speak, around. And so I feel like one of the things that we really need to do is to figure out how to both continue along trying to struggle and trying to address the situation and be honest that this society may be headed towards a collapse. How to wrestle with that and make space for what comes next at the same time. I'm sorry, that's not like a very optimistic viewpoint, but I mean, I really think that like, any of the things like, I think them as fantastic. And I think creating amendment to the Constitution is great, but like any of these things is probably not going to get us to the point of like carbon neutral and addressing the climate crisis within the time frame that we really have. So how do we both continue forward and struggle, recognize that we are probably headed towards a collapse, and how do we figure out how to organize for what comes next at the same time? Sorry to not be optimistic, but
No apologies needed.
Well, for movement rights, I think we work primarily at this time with indigenous communities, tribes here in the U.S. that are interested in rights of nature, recognizing the rights of their traditional lands. There are 5 or 6 tribes that have followed in recognizing rights on their tribal land since Casey led the Ponca Nation to do that first in 2017. They also recognized the right to climate, and that's not a human right to a clean climate. It is the right of the climate to be free from fossil fuel and other harms, and really putting ourselves inside that. So we work with a number of tribes who are looking at whether rights of nature is a tool that can assist them in protecting the ecosystems that that sustain their communities. We also, we do have trainings and things we do for a general open audience on climate change and what you can do where you live, including, looking at rights of nature and corporate power. And I'm sure there's a lot of crossover with some of the offerings and things that Move to Amend does. And I think that it's going to take a lot of us in the street, not today, but I mean, when it's safe, we need to leave our houses. We need to be connected. We need to be in the streets. We need to be our own advocates. We need to be rising like the water. We need to be taking this as seriously as, the news doesn't really cover climate change as if it were the most pressing issue on the earth. We all know what today's news is about. Those are, not important things. The elections are important and COVID is important. But if we do not stand for, if we do not stand up en masse, that's really what we have time for now. And all of these other things are a mosaic. We do need a constitutional, and I really thank Move to Amend, not just for moving forward this idea, but having the national discussion and keeping it at the, at the national level. I think that's a huge contribution that corporate power is continuing to be sort of, in this national dialogue, and that climate justice is a mosaic. There are people who are building green technologies and things to keep plastics out of the ocean, and people who are, helping people get organized for standing in the streets. The Society of Fearless Grandmothers does this great training for grandmothers to stand as a barrier between the police and communities of color advocating for their rights, and building bridges between all of the different communities that we need to work together. So I think, the idea is, what are the actions we can take now? We can tend to our gardens, we can vote, we can do all those kinds of things. And when it is safe, we need to be creating change as loud as we can in the streets and stopping the machinery of corporate power, of fossil fuels, of militarization. And that's my little advocacy spiel. That there are a million places, not everybody is going to be able to do everything, but there's something that everybody can do.
Exactly. And you all have
Thank you, Shannon. If I may,
please.
I would like to add a few things. When I'm looking at the chat here, someone is talking about putting a price on carbon. And I really want to bring up the fact that we really should not try to buy and sell the air. When one looks at carbon trading, carbon sequestration, or any of those issues around that, what that's doing is allowing the polluters to continue to pollute. The things like going into nature-based solutions, the things like going into carbon trading and carbon sequestration, all of those are false solutions, because it is only allowing the corporations to continue to pollute. For instance, in our territory up here with the Ponca, where we have Phillips 66 tank battery refinery, et cetera, in our territory, when one buys the carbon credits or puts a price on carbon, they will continue to pollute in our territory and continue to create an area of environmental genocide. But that wind blows where you are. So it's about renewable energies. It's not about trying to make carbon safe. That's not going to happen, period. And someone else has mentioned a few times about what's going on here in Oklahoma with the EPA, movement rights, and I put out a press release on September the 8th about that, and we're continuing to work on that. After consulting today with our tribal attorney, and many of the other tribes around us, what they did was illegal, flatly illegal. You cannot place the ruling on top of the initial ruling that happened around the Indian Law Act some time ago. And they did it in secret, and they did it at a time that many of the tribes were closed down because of COVID. And they did it without consultation. As part of our treaty rights, and we have, the Ponca have 5 treaties, for instance, that have all been abrogated by the United States, by and we push even further with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People that they must obtain free, prior, and informed consent before anything happens. So the federal government in virtually every area, including the EPA, has failed in its trust responsibility. And the EPA head, Wheeler, worked 14 years for Senator Inhofe, who was the person who stuck this rider bill in the Safety Act of 2005. And when Stitt got this passed, he didn't notify the tribes until the end of August, but he notified the Petroleum Association in July. So we have 100% confidence that this is not going to be allowed to stand. And thank you for thinking of us. I will remind all of us, that our most powerful weapon that connects us all is prayer.
Thank you, Casey. And just an invitation, we are kind of running up against the bottom of the hour, and we wanted to keep this event to 90 minutes. But an invitation to all of our speakers is, as previously mentioned, we will send out a follow-up to everyone here on this call and those who registered, but for whatever reason could not make this call either. A link to this, but also any other links you may have that you feel would be relevant to the subject this evening. So Colin is going to send his remarks. Casey, Shannon, anything that you think would be relevant, please. If you could, within the next day or so, something, and we'll include those links. Just in closing, something follow up. And what I'm hearing is, you know, there's lots to be done from the small scale to the large scale, global, from the local to the global. Anything good, it's all needed. I heard someone once say, we may not get anything until we get everything. That's the kind of movement that needs to be built. So we shall see. There's no deterministic approach to what is going to happen. It is entirely up to us. For those of you interested in the Interfaith Caucus of Move to Amend, we meet monthly. The 19th of October is the next call, sort of promotion there. And I will link and send a notice of that call and how to connect to that in that follow-up email. Just to close, I ran into this quote by Rachel Carson, who many years, in fact, decades ago, said this: humanity is challenged as it has never challenged before to prove its maturity and its mastery, not of nature, but of itself. And that is certainly our challenge. And going forth, hopefully we can figure out means, arenas, forums to continue this conversation, but just as importantly, if not more importantly, to figure out, pardon my French, what the hell we can do together. And that is ever so important in these days, to do it effectively, meaningfully, but with spirit and with love. So all of that, thank you so much for being a part of this. Appreciate your time and commitment. And let's figure out how we can carry on this engagement together and with others. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, move to amend.